gets to decide. It's certain groups get to decide who lives near them, and 90% of us are outside of that certain group. We are not permitted to be part necessarily of that communities. And we see that at the kibbutz Ayat HaShachar. They have an absorption center for Ethiopians. The Ethiopians are allowed to live in the absorption center, but after a few years they are shunted off, sent away to Kiryat Gat or where have you, to be truly absorbed, because there's no concept that they can ever be members or join the kibbutz. And of course the kibbutz will not say it's because of race. They will say, well, they're not the right human material, they don't have the right ideological background. There's always an excuse, I think. So I think we can skip over a little bit of this idea of Israeliness, because he talked about kind of this imagined community. I don't think we need to discuss that as much. There is also part of this myth is the idea that my democracy, the social justice democracy or what have you, is being threatened by all these undemocratic forces. And when you read through, you find that they talk about the nature of the immigrants is that they had no democratic tradition. Russian immigrants, they are weighing down Israel because they have Soviet background. Israel's ultra-Orthodox, they are a threat to our democracy. And Ben David at the Taub Center said, we are approaching the democratic point of no return. And it's interesting, this idea that because the Russians or Mizrahim came from non-democratic countries, and they did, let's say, but where was David Ben-Gurion from? Someone remembers? Was he born in a democracy? No, he wasn't, but he created this democracy, right? So somehow, he didn't burden us. He didn't weigh us down. But the Russians, they're weighing us down. So it's interesting. The concept would be that basically only American or British Jews would be good human material immigrants. But basically none of the early Zionists would qualify. Where was Golda Meir from? She was not from a democracy. So why is there a fear? Huh? A little bit. Okay. 5 minutes. Israel's education. I think another thing we see is this question of education. One of the excuses, and Steve Plout has written a new paper in Middle East Studies, or Middle East Forum, saying basically that there's no truth to the idea that Mizrahim are discriminated against, because when you control for their lack of education, they basically got what they deserved. They're not as well educated, so they're not being discriminated against. And there is basically a tradition of stereotype that says the Mizrahim were not well educated. But I'd like to see the study that shows how well educated many of the early Ashkenazi Zionists were. Because I've seen many quotes, and it'd be interesting to know, where people said, if a man went to elementary school in Poland, he was considered educated. Many of these immigrants were not educated from Europe. But what we do is we look today and we look around the room and we say, well, most of the educated people are Ashkenazi, and most of the Mizrahim are not as well educated. So let's project that backwards to 1909. And pretend that that was definitely the way that it was back then. But I think there is a lot of evidence that that's not the case. And I think that we see in some of these stereotypes a traditional anti-Semitic stereotype. Like we see here in Australia, the idea that the Jews were kind of illiterate savages here. These are Ashkenazi Jews, by the way, getting off the boat. But the irony is that this is reversed in Israel, so that those people are basically depicted as Mizrahim. So I think we have this kind of this burden of history. We have a burden of landscape issue in this country, of the segregation in the landscape. And when I looked at some of the quotes about the origins of apartheid in 1950 South Africa, I found a very interesting commonalities between the planning authorities in South Africa and the fact that they were also educated in Germany. And some of the early planning authorities here, like Ariel Sharon, and Arthur Rupin. And they had similar ideas about central place theory, the similar ideas you see here from Herman Guillaume's quote about the idea of perfect planning. And planning based on ethnicities. And by the way, you see this also in America with the projects. You see it in France with the banlieue, that is where they put most of the Moroccan immigrants. And here with the development towns. And here we have a nice aerial photo of Soweto. By the way, when Soweto was first built, it was not supposed to be dilapidated, like full of poverty. It was supposed to be a good vision to supposedly raise the blacks up. And I think there was also in many ways a systematic idea here and certain similarities. I'm not saying that Israel is an apartheid country, but I'm saying that when we look at the planning origins, there are many problems. I think we also find, as he mentioned, an idea that there is a race theory about the idea that different groups of Jews are basically totally different, and that there is a box you can put all of them in. I can't read through all of this, but but Hannah Arendt makes this claim about the German Jews. Arthur Rupin talked about purifying the Jewish race. Max Nordau basically said the same thing. And it's interesting. So we come then to today, to 2011, where Israel Prize winner Rubinstein is claiming that, all these Russian immigrants, they are a threat to our genetics. They don't have anything in common with our genes. And I think it's very sad, because I think that there's a lot of anti-Semitic stereotyping that talks about the Jewish race theories, and I think that some of these early Zionists basically adopted some of that. So let's come to a conclusion. All of you can download my paper online. It has many more quotes. It's much, I think, more in-depth discussion of some of this. But we see this othering of Mizrahim. We see this idea that there are binaries in Judaism, that you are Mizrahi, I'm Ashkenazi, and there's some huge gulf between us, which is basically, I think, in many cases nonsense, because when you look at the Jewish world, it's a huge mosaic. There's no clear black and white here or there. And I think that's basically where I want to stop. I think that today we can see here Ansel Pfeffer replying on Twitter about one of these racist comments at Haaretz. He talks about how, well, you have a right to do this. But I think that we excuse a lot of what happens in this narrative by pretending it's freedom of speech, and I don't think it is. I think it points to a very real problem in society, a very real problem where people like Maren Ben-Venisti, who was the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, says, I do not accept all this Mizrahi whining, because what would the Mizrahim have done if we had not been there to take them in, as if we saved them? This concept that Mayor Ariel once said Russians should not have the right to vote. One person wrote an op-ed saying that there should be a separate Arab parliament. Kids dressed up like the KKK for Purim. And how was it presented in the media? It's an epic fail. It's a kind of fadicha. No, it's more than a fadicha. This is not a good thing. It's not just a joke. And I think that's basically it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Our final speaker this afternoon, this session, is Professor Henriette Dahan-Kalev from Ben Gurion University of the Negev. She founded and chaired the Gender Studies program at Ben Gurion. Her recent book is titled Palestinian Activism in Israel, a Bedouin Woman Leader. This is 2012 Palgrave Macmillan. She is the author and editor of a number of publications in political theory and democracy, feminist resistance, and race and ethnic studies. And her topic is colorism in Israel? ?
Thank you. I will speak from here with your permission, and you're still a little bit in siesta, so I'll try to
wake up.
Yeah, I'll try to.
I think they're very much awake after all
catch up.
this. So
Yeah, exactly. Catch up. I actually, you provoked me, and I would like very much to continue to catch up on what you said, but I promised to speak of colorism, so let me share with you my ideas about colorism. I think speaking of race is not speaking of racism, and speaking of colonialism colonies and colonization is not speaking of colonialism. And speaking of skin color is not speaking of colorism. And first of all, I would like to make some theoretical distinctions in order to place my theoretical framework in which I would like to speak about Israeli colorism. Since, as I said, colorism is not racism, and colorism is not colonialism, and colorism has nothing to do with other fields, I would like to support my approach by saying that colorism is not reducible to racism, is not reducible to other paradigms of studies. And I think this is a new field that's developing in the United States and not always being reducible or being, we cannot combine it to or compare it to what's going on in colorism in Israel. By saying that, I'm saying that colorism is not something that I can discuss by bringing examples from being an ethnic group or showing some kind of social stratification and or talking about the color of skin just as a fact. Speaking of colorism is speaking of cultural value attached to skin color. And speaking of colorism is cultural attached to skin color, while it is not, it is hierarchized, and sometimes we don't speak of skin color such as white. It is transparent, and theoretically it's most often in most studies uses as the 0 point of reference, as opposed to speaking of black skin, red skin, white, yellow skin, etc. So what I would like to say is that speaking of colorism is speaking of cultural value that is attached to social categories, and it differs from country to country and from place to place. And when I started to read this corpus of studies in the United States, I found out that it is difficult to migrate it, to import it to what's going on in Israel. But I started doing some research with my colleague Maya Maor in Israel. And the basic thing that we have started doing, instead of going through some kind of empirical in the field work in sociology in order to understand what's going on with colorism in Israel, we had to begin by rereading and revisiting or reviewing the corpus of studies that's done in Israel on racism, colonialism, post-colonialism, Orientalism, and what you want. So what I'm going to do here is to present very briefly a few ideas and a few insights that we have studied from this body of knowledge, and to show a little bit how we intend to continue as it is an ongoing work. So when we are reading the corpus in Israel, what we find is that the vast majority of studies is on Ethiopians. And the vast majority of studies that mention the word color and mention the word skin color and shade and the skin tone, etc., is focusing on a vast majority of research corpus from the time that the Ethiopian came, like 2-3 years after the Mivtza Moshe, which was in 1985 in Israel. And since then, most colorism studies or studies of skin color is developing from that time. The reference is to the Ethiopian population, and this Ethiopian population assumes the transparency of all the rest. And this is to say that all the rest in Israel are white. That is, the binarism is a binarism that is blind to the previous dichotomy between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. And here, when we read the studies until 85 or 87, what we find is that speaking of Mizrahim Ashkenazim, it is implied that the Ashkenazim are transparent. They are the 0 point of reference as whites, whereas the Mizrahim are black. But black in different nuance, because they're not entirely black, but they're not entirely white as well. There are the works writing about the Mizrahim try to distinguish them from the Ashkenazim, whereas Ashkenazim, there is no work about Ashkenazim or not whatsoever. I think I counted only 2 articles written on Ashkenazim at that time, until the 80s, the late 80s. And Ashkenazim are not studied at all. That is, their skin color is not relevant, they are not referred at, and sometimes they are only opposed to the Mizrahim. When I'm saying Mizrahim, I'm saying that they are studied, again, in a community of Jews, not with reference to the Palestinians, that we're talking here about a community within the green line of 20%, and not much less until the 80s or the 1980s and the 1990s. So again, when there are works that are referring to skin color of Palestinians, the Mizrahim become part of the white population. My point here is to show you that skin color is like a very relative denominator in order to keep this binarism that separates between white and blacks, and there are of course stereotypes. You have mentioned so many quotes, so you did part of the work for me, but I think that whenever we relate to we find in the literature analysis of skin color, of description of images of Mizrahim, etc. So what we find is that the Mizrahim become black. So the idea is that along the history of Israel, when we study skin color, we see that skin color function in order to tag, in order to relate some cultural value, and to talk and to speak of it as a resource. Now, when skin color is a resource, it's only when it is related to the whites. And here, from the 1990s, when the big wave of Russian came from the former Soviet Union, what we find is that we have a new category of white skin color. I would expect, in general, that they would become part of the Ashkenazim. But they did not become part of the Ashkenazim. That is, they are studied separately as Russians. And that's why I had this question in the morning about why calling them ethnic racial group, because they're not ethnic racial group. They still are not defined in the public discourse and nor in the studies as either part of Ashkenazim or ethnic group like the Edot, the Mizrahim, or Palestinian like a part of nationality, and nor like a non-Jews. That is, they are referred as non-Jews when they are statistically counted as part of the Russian who we have some kind of doubts, or the religious doubt about their being Jews. So what I want to say here about the Russians, I think it's still a group that has skin color that is transparent, just like that of Ashkenazim. And when we go back to the differentiation between Ashkenazim and, between Russian and Ethiopians that came to the country relatively at the same time, the second wave of the Ethiopian came in the 1990s, early 1994, I think, Mivtza Shlomo, and they were only 1/10 of the population of the Russians. Here again, what we find is that the Russians are not searched on the basis of their skin color. They are not the skin color is not discussed, although in the advertisement there are many there is much use in advertising them as positive and promoting, for example, cosmetic products, etc., and so forth. Whereas when the Ethiopian are presented in the advertisement, they are presented in a derogatory way, in inferior, as incapable, as groups that need to be more saved, supported, educated, etc., and so forth. So what I would like to say here that I think that speaking of skin color helps us to separate from the discussion of racism, helps us to separate from the Orientalism, helps us to separate from colonialism and all these paradigms of analysis, in order to understand that the first sign of skin color, of appearance cannot be reduced in order to understand how people use either resources or disadvantages within the Israeli society, and the skin color becomes like a seismograph, changes and moves from one category to the other in order to just make some kind of resource or cultural resource or cultural price or tag in order to position themselves, the different groups, within the Israeli society, within the Israeli strata, and in order to gain or to struggle for their position in Israel. There are 2 or 3 categories. How long do I have still?
7 minutes.
Okay, good. There are 2 or 3 categories that are hardly searched or studies within this corpus of studies that I have searched together with Maya Ma'or. The intersection with gender, it's hardly related to, and we understand that skin color is the way it serves men and women, the way it serves gender, the way it serves appearance and interrelationship within society is very important. Nevertheless, we hardly find studies about gender. We have Shlomit Leer, Naaman, I think 2 or 3 studies that discuss the Mizrahi women efforts to invest in bleaching themselves through cosmetic products, through straightening their hair, and so on and so forth. But again, in contrast to that, the blonde hair and blue-eyed is, of course, used as a beauty resource and promote women. In this respect, promote women, of course, in different strata in society, including gaining better positions, jobs, etc., and so forth. Another one is that in 1995, when a blood scandal of Ethiopians in Israel burst out, and that was on the ground of blood donation, where the blood donation was spilled out without letting the donators knowing it, because a suspect of having a high risk of HIV. It was discovered in 1996, and that was a turning point in the Ethiopian position in Israel, that until then it was considered that they were doing lots of efforts to assimilate within Israeli society, and they wanted most to become Israelis. That was the first generation. When this scandal was exposed, the second generation turned their back to Israel, and they started to identify with the black diaspora, with the United States black movement, and they started adopting marks of culture like music and theater, and some of it we have seen here, but not telling us that there is actually a subversive and a resisting movement of young Ethiopians. Now, these young Ethiopians also, thank you. Now, these young Ethiopians also continue to struggle as resisting groups and movements, not only within Israel, but they also make lots of efforts to leave Israel. That is, their identification with Israel is very weakened since the time that they realized that actually, no matter what they do in order to become Jews, they will always have, will be marked by their black skin color. So my point here is to try to say that until now, most of the studies are focusing on skin color as if it is a neutral trait as if it is a biological fact. But from what I try to present here is that we need, as scholars, to invest much more in more critical reading of the material that already exists, and we saw here two examples. And I suggest that the category of colorism would be developed as a separate field of studies and a paradigms that will allow us to understand much better that color, skin color, cannot be reduced to any other paradigmatic studies, but to be studied in itself, as I see that it happens in other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all three speakers. We now have time for a discussion, of course. We'll take questions and have answers immediately, but to do that, I'd like you to keep your questions short, please. Okay, thank you. Yes? The microphone.
Hello. Okay, quickly. This is for Yehuda. I was wondering if you can talk about how the shift, how the blackening of Mizrahim shift with the arrival of Ethiopian immigration. And I'm thinking, back to that comment that I think Sarah Feinberg made about that Shas commercial of the Russian bride on the one hand, and then I'm thinking about, Rav Ovadiah's staunch support of Ethiopians as truly Jewish. And is there some kind of affiliation between Mizrahim and Ethiopians, who are perhaps the new Israeli blacks?
Okay, first, thank you for the question. So ideas of, basically ideas of colors before the creation of the states and how it might have changed with the arrival of 800,000 immigrants from Middle East and North African countries, yeah? According to my research, ideas of race and coloring were extremely prevalent during the mid-1930s and 40s in the Yishuv. It's several scholars begin to arguing that most Jews are actually white, while all the rest, primarily Yemenite and North African and Middle Easterns, are blacks. Those terms were used primarily to limit immigration to the Yishuv, and basically arguing that they carry with them diseases. They might not be able to contribute to a modern state. So those are nations. With the arrival of those immigrants, I think we need to consider two things. One, how the discourse change and it begins to define bodies and basically claim entitlement to the land and to the Zionist project. Those are considered primarily, Sephardic and Mizrahim are primarily considered as immigrants. They don't have part in the Zionist enterprise or the Jewish state. Not to mention the fact that they didn't have part early on. But it becomes clear after 1948. At the same time, according to my evidence, from the mid-1960s, we hear voices among Sephardic Mizrahi communities. And I deliberately emphasize the plural here, because there is no one Mizrahi character. That's to romanticize and falsify and whatever you can name it. We can hear how those immigrants begin to identify themselves as black, not only to color them, to define their skin color, but to mobilize political activity.
What about the Ethiopians, which was the question that we need to...
Oh, about the Ethiopians.
Sorry.
I don't have a clear answer to that, I'm sorry. But I do think that there are tensions between Sephardim Mizrahim and other groups and other minorities. We shouldn't see Sephardim Mizrahim as those romantic heroes that sacrificed. In many ways, they project racism and use similar language against immigrants, against Palestinian Arabs, also against Ethiopians. That would be my guess.
But wouldn't you say that the arrival of Ethiopian Jews in Israel in a way whitened the Mizrahi Jews? Because by definition, that's what happened. So Bar-Yosef's support is interesting because...
For those who need to be whitened, it whitened them. I will say that.
And do they need to be whitened? Do they see themselves as need to be whitened?
It will hard for me to say. I'm not representative of a whole Mizrahi community. But I will say that, yes, if you are being disenfranchised for so many years, of course you will use whatever means necessary to claim whatever color in order to be accepted, while you haven't been accepted before.
Okay, yes. Okay.
But of course, others could answer that.
Okay, Henriette, do you want just a quick response to that?
Yeah, very quickly. I think we are here about the fourth generation of Mizrahim and mixed marriage, and therefore there is no unified answer. I think everyone takes his own or her own position and try to claim whether they belong or not belong. Something that it's a resource just to assimilate and to hide. We call it Ashkenazify. And Ashkenazify is a very strong term for the Mizrahim who bleach themselves. And therefore, I think there is no one definite answer. It's a question of capital, of cultural capital.
Okay, thank you. There's never one definite answer, I think, but okay. Oh, a lot of people. Yes. Oh, you have the mic. Well, you're it then. Okay, yes. But yeah. No, great, but just quickly.
I'm really interested in sort of what I feel like is a movement afoot among young Israelis to reclaim the term Arab Jew as a kind of cultural capital. And I've seen that. I think I have my own ideas about what it's about, but I was curious to hear maybe you talk about it, what it means for young Israelis to reclaim Arab Jew as a kind of statement against whiteness anyway, I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
Who is you?
All of you.
Oh, no.
Whoever wants to take that.
We don't have much time, but yeah.
And my other question is about solidarity between other groups in Israel, and I'm curious why the kind of deployment of blackness across groups has not produced any kind of solidarity movements between these groups, as far as I can tell, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm curious about that as well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, let's do this just very briefly, though. You done? You want to answer? Henriette? Okay. Yeah.
Okay, Arab Jews is a term invented by sociologists in Israel, and those who are defined by that do not accept it. Vast majority just do not accept it. Moroccan in Morocco differentiated between Moroccans, Muslim and Moroccans Jews by saying Muslimin ulihud, the Jews and the Muslims. So this is a kind of artificial tag that is stick to them, and they don't. It just don't. They don't adopt it. They just don't want it, and therefore I think it failed. It's only among us academics that we use it.
I don't mean to argue too much, but
No.
I had a student who, this was her way of saying, I'm not white, I'm a person of color, I'm an Arab Jew.
Well, this is a young person. I'm talking about his parents and his grandparents.
I'm talking about young university students now who say, and I'm very interested in this rehabilitation of this term for what.
It's not a rehabilitation. I'm trying to tell you that it's a new one. It's a nouveau name, nouveau term, like nouveau riche, like new money. It's a nouveau resource. So it's not. It does not stick to the old generation. That's.
I can just turn this quickly to Seth. No, because one of the quotes that you did bring actually were by Salman al-Salha, who complained about that sort of dark-skinned security guard at Ben-Gurion, airport. And he's an Arab Israeli, and yet he was making that very racist point about the Mizrahi Jew. Do you have any ideas about the lack of solidarity that Rachel was asking about? Do you want to say something about it? Or?
Well, I will just tell you my own work with teaching Arabs and spending a lot of time with them, that there's definitely just as much racism among Arabs against darker people or black people. Even among black Arabs, you have some black Arabs that live in Rahat or also here in the old city. And in Rahat, they call them where they live the Shakhanat al-Abid, where the slaves lived. So, Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't think, by the way, I think many of us are wrong to think that Arabs necessarily don't identify as white. I think some of them do. I think, as she said, it all depends on how people self-identify. So maybe in America, they want to be people of color because that somehow is good. So I guess that would be my answer.
They don't even marry with each
Okay.
other. The Abed and
Right. Okay, thank you. Oh, wow. Yes. You, yeah.
Can they identify themselves? Sorry?
It's your turn to identify yourself again, yes.
I'm still Albert Oppenheimer, and
You're still, that's good,
Okay.
good.
but a question to Seth Franzmann. I liked your lecture. Now you quote Herzl. Of course, he said that in the Judenstaat, but in Altneuland, if you read it, you have a very clear parameter of the Westerner who tells the Arab what the right life is, and the intelligent Arab understands it. Now you had a counter movement really by people like Heinrich Löwe or Eugen Höflich who became Pan-Asiats and to try to integrate everyone, but they again did so from detesting Western Europe and detesting the Turks and so on. So it was also kind of othering. But I think this innocence of the arch-Zionism under Herzl is somewhat not so clear.
I wasn't trying to say that it wasn't really about Herzl. It was trying to symbolize the idea that initially normative Zionism was supposed to be about the Jews, just like the Declaration of Independence doesn't talk about restricting immigration from Morocco for the disabled or the elderly, which actually they did in the 50s. There's nothing about that in the Declaration of Independence. I was just saying that the normative idea of Zionism was that it's about all of the Jews. So as you said, Herzl himself is a very complex character. And every Zionist was. There is no one thing. It was just a symbolic quote.
Emily in the back. But the mic must reach you first.
I think that, does it attach to anything? Okay. I think it's very important in the context of a conference like this in which we're given three categories, Jews, color, race, to recognize the degree to which the subject produces a certain kind of structure, which ironically replicates structural features of what we're objecting to. In other words, there's nobody in this room who isn't going to object to racism. There's nobody in this room who doesn't understand that the Sephardic Jews suffered in a certain way in this country, that African Americans in the United States. So I am an Ashkenazi Jew who straightened her hair in Harlem till I had a little curly-haired blonde child, who married a Moroccan who's lighter in skin than I am, and whose kids insist they're not Ashkenazi, they're Moroccans. So I don't know what you call that, but it's all very specific. And once Mark Twain said that he was asked if he was philo-Semitic, and he said, no, not particularly. It's just that if you've told me that a human being is a human being, you've already told me the worst. And I think that when one looks at the ways in which societies have typically been exclusionary, racist, anti-Semitic, whatever you want, what you see is that that's a repetition, and we're looking at that pattern. What we're not looking at are the other forces at work. What were the attempts toward integration? The United States has an incredibly complicated history in relation to integration, which wasn't a bad ideal. It just didn't see certain things that 20 years later we do see. So I think it's when we're being critical of previous generations, when we're applying our discourse to them, what we have to be careful to do is, first of all, to understand the world in which other people function, and also to be sensitive to the degree to which our discourse is labeling. It's producing categories that define the behavior of other people. I mean, my daughter, who was a Mora Chayelet, worked with the Ethiopian community. And she said that primarily every day was a dilemma. Do you teach a little girl to look people in the eye? Because if she doesn't in Israeli society, she's lost. But if she does, her father feels humiliated. What do you respect? What do you try to change? How do you solve a problem?
Okay.
And I think that that's part of what generations have done.
Thank you. You could pass it on to there, please. To there, please. To there, yeah. But yeah, who would like to respond?
Well, replication, and then that goes to Ephraim. Why there is a panel of Arab Jew? Question mark.
Question mark.
I mean, that's a big question. Why it has to be a separate panel about Arab Jew? So that's one thing. About when you talked about those various experiences, I just want to remind that in my work, I'm talking about exactly those social scientists that try to create those fixed notions of identity. But of course, if you look into the experiences of various Sephardic Mizrahi individuals, it's much richer. They never identify themselves along one category. They, especially when it goes into issues of labor and economic issues, they always play on multiple identities. Just as we are in our own lives, we are never really one thing. We are not perceive ourselves through this narrow-minded idea of self. It's much more richer. So you have Sephardic Jews that at one time they are Arab Jews when they want to highlight some kind of political agenda. At other times they are Moroccans, and other times they are Israelis, and so forth and so on.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, please.
Emily, thank you for your point. I think it's a very important point, and it falls right into my idea of colorism, because, for example, the elaboration that you made helps me to say that if the skin color or the colorism of Mizrahim was studied, we would find that their scale or line, and there are two theories, I don't want to go into it now, their scale starts from the Sweden skin color to the Abed skin color, which is like Ethiopians. So what I would like to say here is that this kind of problematization would be much more clear and not categorizing and tagging, but rather understanding that Mizrahim in Israel or Palestinians in Israel, doesn't matter, when we study their skin color, we study how they are stratified within the culture and what kind of resource of culture they have and how they can solve the problem of the way they're positioning within the society. What your daughter is telling you is that she has a dilemma, or the person that she wants to educate has a dilemma moving from one community to the other. Why not opening this spectrum and understanding that we can actually function just as we function as identities. I don't function as the mother when I'm in the university. I function as a scholar when I'm in the university, and vice versa. And moving from one culture to the other and being able to flexibly move from one sphere to the other without tagging the price or pay, or making the person pay the price just because he or she has this or another color. I think this is what we are aiming at, into understanding where to put ourselves within society.
Let me just add that what you said earlier about the Russian Jewish immigrants from the 19th onwards suggests that also Ashkenazi's whiteness here is not so simple. It was always a spectrum as well. Even in the 1950s, 40s, and 30s, and before that, Herzl had a lot to say about Ostjuden and so forth. So I mean, it's true that Ashkenazi, on the one hand, were transparent, but even within that, there were so many different shades and colors. So not a unified concept as well.
I was talking about the context. That is, it's an advantage to be an Ashkenazi,
No,
even if.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Jonathan Karp, Binghamton University. My question is for Yehuda. I really learned a lot from your presentation. It was really fascinating, and I didn't know the body of social science work and that you referred to, and I think that's really wonderful material. But what your paper didn't talk about, you talked about the American racial scene as almost as a kind of bogeyman. It's like, be very afraid. You know, it will become like it is in America, if I understood you correctly. And you didn't, and so I want to know if the people that you were reading, Chomsky and Frankenstein and Bar-Yosef and others, exhibited any awareness of the tremendous changes that were taking place in racial understanding, in anthropology, in social science, with people like Gunnar Myrdal writing An American Dilemma in the late 1930s, E. Franklin Frazier, Charles Silberman a bit later, Kenneth Clark, I could go on. Not that their writings were perfect, not that we wouldn't criticize them today and see retrospectively, as you put it, shortcomings. But nevertheless, their work was pushing towards Brown versus Board of Education. It was pushing towards desegregation. Is there an awareness that, despite its manifold problems that exist even today, certainly, that the racial complexion, so to speak, of American life was shifting dramatically in this period? You depict them as kind of reifying a certain kind of racist hierarchy and not being susceptible to the kinds of dramatic changes that were taking place in American thought at the time.
Thank you. Yehuda.
First, thank you for your kind words. And so I'll just, yes, they were informed by this kind of literature from the 1930s and 40s. And Chomsky, Minkowicz, Patai, Frankenstein were deeply interested in creating a sense of desegregation. As a matter of fact, and they were not isolated from one another, by the way. Patai was in close conversation with Frankenstein. While Patai was moved to the US by 1948 and stayed there for the rest of his life, he kept on exchanging letters with Frankenstein, which is extremely fascinating material. And they both share this kind of sympathy and deep concern with those Orientals. But at the same time, this level of sentiment, and I'm not going to portray them as evil, look what they did to us. No, that's not the case. But you can hurt somebody that you love. In most cases, it happen. You really care, and then we must not see that as some kind of sentiment that is being expressed. It's much more complicated than that. So I try to really read it in a very nuanced form. And yes, they did attempt to create, they were really concerned about the Israeli society. And in ideas of education, in ideas of labor and so on. But that didn't prevent them from beginning talking about those Jews as not productive to the state, and that have some kind of, that are impaired intellectually and mentally. And that's why Frankenstein, in the late 70s, he begins talking about we need to save them. But of course, Sephardim Mizrahim, some of them really actually believed that they need to be saved at the time. Others, of course not, and then you see the Black Panthers coming in. So this is really really short answer, but of course there's much more to say about it.
Thank you. We have less than 5 minutes and a few questions. So maybe now we'll just take the questions just in comments very, very quickly. Okay, if you could pass the mic. And so just hear some of the other people, and we'll try and give you a chance to respond. But just very, very briefly, please. We're losing precious time. Forget the mic. Yes.
Sarit Kaufman Simchon. I have a question for Seth. I would like you to answer your rhetoric question. What is the difference between we must decide who our neighbors are and apartheid? Because I felt quite overwhelmed and disoriented by your discussion spanning from Herzl to Gideon Levy, and it was very cursory. And I had the feeling that you were jumping to conclusions that I would like to hear this answer from you, since I assume many people say that I would like to pick up their neighbors. And,
okay, yeah, thank you. Yes. Try without the mic, see if it works. I know, I understand, but we're, yeah.
I have two remarks, one for Yehuda. I agree with your framework, and it's very important, but I'm not sure about putting all these scholars in the same place. And Patai was completely marginalized in Israeli academy, and I refer you to Orit Abu-Hav's study of the Israel anthropology. So, and Chomsky, I mean, I did 3 degrees here in social science. I never heard about them in my life. And I checked now. So again, are we talking about constructing the social science and the dichotomies here, or for Americans? There's a little bit more complications here. The second one is for Henriette, just for the Russians. Russians were depicted by colors by social agents in the social services, by the press, and the main categories are white Russians versus Russians from the stands, also something like this, and you can find, I wrote about it, and you can find others who maybe refer to it. So again, I'm not sure about your depictions here that there was no coloring about the Russians. It was very important. And then that's it.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. And one last question, or yes, please.
Quickly, colorism often takes a kind of dominant perspective and internalizes it, so you turn it against your own peoples. And so I was just struck by some of the things that Yehuda had. That Seth mentioned, that in bringing in stereotypes about Jews that were then turned to colorize or discriminate against. I just wanted to know also, though, your discussion of Russian and Haredim as being othered in certain ways seems to kind of come across in conflict with Henriette's idea of colorism as a kind of dominant notion of stratifying people. So I just wondered if we needed to have discourses of the ways in which you make people inferior, and there are different technologies of doing that. Color is one way, primitivism is another way. I think colorism is very important, but I think we need to be alive to the ways in which other discourses are being used, like primitivism, to suppress people and render them inferior.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we'll take these as comments, not questions, because I think you all need your coffee and you only have 15 minutes to get it. So I just want to thank the 3 speakers for a terrific, fascinating panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.